Hello and welcome to this preview episode of the second season of In Session. I am very happy to be joined today by Senator Seth Bongartz, and we are going to be focusing on what was one of the major topics in the last season of In Session, and indeed during the last legislative session, and what promises to be a huge issue for the legislature to tackle in the upcoming session, and that is education. Obviously, there's a lot of other issues that we're going to talk about on this new season of In Session, and there are a lot of great episodes waiting to be made. We're going to start recording on Saturday mornings again, starting on January 24th, and so look for episodes coming weekly, starting at the end of January, coinciding with the legislative session getting underway. But for today, we're just going to be drilling down onto education, talking about what happened in the previous session, what's been going on between sessions, and what to look forward to, and also what it's going to mean for all of us here in Bennington County. So without further ado, welcome, Senator Seth Bongartz.
Well, happy to be here.
Very happy to have you with us today. Absolutely. So just to get started, you are someone who has a long history, both in your personal and professional life, being involved as on many different levels with education in the state of Vermont. So by way of introduction for yourself, would you mind talking a little bit about your background and specifically how it relates to your education expertise?
Well, really, I don't claim to have deep education expertise. I mean, I'm a legislator, and legislators, end up taking on projects that they, going on committees and learning partially as you go. But I spent 19 years on the board at Vermont. That's really what I did, and so. And I actually chaired the board for 15 years. And so that's really my education experience, but a school's a school. And I really, of course, through that process, learned about the issues that come with poverty, with mental illness, and all of the good things that go with it, all the great things that go with a school. So that school board experience is really what I really bring to the table.
Absolutely. And before we get into some of the details on the education sort of legislation that's happening right now and the contemplated changes, what drew you to be involved in that way for so long with Burton and with education in your community?
Kids. I just care about kids. And we've got a mixed system in Vermont that operates together and intermingled and worked very well for years, for actually 200 years. It really is just kids and seeing ways to make sure that kids have the opportunities they deserve. I mean, we need to be thinking, and we need to be talking about, we need to be thinking, and we actually need to be striving to achieve excellent educational opportunity for all Vermont children. That's the goal, and that's what I care about.
Absolutely.
Every part of the state.
And that's been coming up against, and this is sort of the themes that came through the previous legislative session, the major changes that are happening, how to do that in a way that certainly from the sort of executive side from the governor's office is being framed around the simultaneous need for cost effectiveness, for possible cost cutting. Can you just talk a little bit about what transpired in the previous legislative session and especially sort of where things ended up with what we now all know as Act 73?
Well, we kind of ended up, I guess you could say, halfway. But I think we do have to step back for a second and acknowledge that we have a funding formula that is not working. It's clearly broken. And we're seeing, double-digit increases on an frankly, on an annual basis. We would have last year, except that we brought down the rate because we had enough of money to do that. But that's not going to last. So we do have to we have to change the system and get a handle on the system, and doing that in a way that actually improves educational opportunities as opposed to taking away, is really that's what we have to, that's the nut we have to crack.
Absolutely. And what is the proposed sort of pathway to change through Act 73 and coming out of the previous legislative session?
Well, out of the previous session, it's still the world is still looking for maps. That was the charge of the task force, and the system right now, actually the way the legislation is written, is conditioned on the passage of a map. Of course, we have the ability to change that. So right now the element as we left last June or was it very end of May? Actually, I think it was May 31st, the last day of May, is the map that then sort of is the basis for tying everything together. That's the way it was left.
Absolutely. And so there was a task force that came together, an 11-member task force that went out and got to work trying to understand what a redistricting statewide might look like. And I just pulled a couple of basic pieces of information from the report. They talked about 5,000 Vermonters from 96 towns. I was interested to see that they said that represented at least 11 counties of the 14 in Vermont. There weren't real details about how that came together, but that clearly was a significant and deliberative process, but it was condensed through time. And so there was one part that I thought it would be important to sort of bring up, and would be interested for you to address, where they said, despite multiple avenues for engagement, significant barriers limited participation from groups most dependent on public systems and most affected by structural changes. The compressed timeline, the limited number of hearings, reliance on virtual tools, and lack of engagement supports such as stipends, childcare, transportation assistance, outreach through trusted partners, made it difficult to reach low-income families, residents with disabilities, people of color, and other historically marginalized groups, students and younger Vermonters, and caregivers with inflexible work schedules or limited internet access. And so that element of sort of which voices are included and which aren't, how do you feel that will be potentially addressed coming into the legislative session, with the understanding that what really came out of this task force was not a resolution around district mapping?
Yeah. So, that issue about accessibility to the process is one that permeates, and it's one we actually talked a lot about when I was on the House Natural Resources Committee putting together Act 181, and it's not easy to everybody's aware of the issue, and we try to do what we can to be as inclusive, figure out ways to be as inclusive as we possibly can, but it's it remains a challenge. It's probably always going to be a challenge, frankly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, coming out of the task force's work, they put together their report, and they did not recommend a change to existing district and supervisory union maps. What they did put forward were these sort of 3 different pathways, which are these cooperative education service areas, strategic voluntary mergers, and comprehensive regional high schools. And the cooperative education service areas they suggested were sort of splitting the state into 5. There's a map included in the report that are Champlain Valley, Northeast, Southeast, Southwest, and the Winooski Valley. What does this report mean for where things are headed, given that so much of what came in Act 73 was conditional on having sort of hard redistricting maps?
It's hard to tell. I think what it does is demonstrate the complexity of the issue. So it's going to be, the maps are still what the legislation continues to call for. So how we're going to handle that as we go into the session, we'll have to see. This was a task force job was to make recommendations, and they didn't really do that. So we're going to have to just go forward, kind of picking up where we left off last year. There's a lot of information in that report that's worth considering, and certainly the notion of the cooperative service districts, or BOCES, or whatever you want to call it, is one that probably makes sense in kind of any circumstance, because what they really are cooperative units, and then you buy the services that make sense to you that can be provided more efficiently, and so to the extent that that's there and we can put those together, I don't know if it's 5 or if it's by county or if it's what, but there's something to that. Actually, the ability to do it is in place now, and it's happening in Windham County. I'm not sure if it's all of Windham County, but part of Windham County has both these kind of for some services. So that's something that clearly is going to be on the table, and it my instinct is makes sense kind of no matter what the structure is that we end up with.
And what sort of stood out to you, or was possibly a little unexpected in that report?
Well, so they had a charge, and they didn't meet the charge. on the one hand. I think, it certainly is true that we're trying to do a lot, relatively fast, and but that's often the case, and we have to. But I think, well, I guess it really is the complexity and the fact that there is resistance to maps. People are concerned, and because this gets to the challenge of this, because one of the things we have to be careful about as we go forward is we don't want to end up with a system that kind of says one size fits all. Regions of the state are very different. They have different needs. Schools have different needs within even districts. And we have to be careful that we maintain the ability of districts and principals to be entrepreneurial, and to take some risks, do some things that make sense for their schools. And so I think the notion, like for instance, we were originally talking about the 5 big districts. That's a little more. That kind of top-down worries me a little bit. Actually, it worries me a lot. So we have to figure out a way to put this together. We do have to do something about the broken funding system. We need to fix the funding system, and then we need to do. As we do that, we need to do it in a way that A, doesn't do damage. And actually, I think the report talked about that. Doesn't do damage, and B, actually enhances the opportunity for kids.
And can you, I know there's a lot of complexity to it, but can you sort of run through what the current funding system is and what some of the contemplated changes are to it? I know that could take up all of our time today and more, but I think it would be good to get into that.
The current funding system was designed to bring some level of equity to the system. The old system is absolutely true. Property wealthy towns could make much less effort and get more than property poor towns, and so that system was clearly unfair and wasn't working right. Act 60 was designed, to help ameliorate that and bring things together a little bit, the high and the low. It's ended up having, over time, it's really got exacerbated by COVID and all the demands that were placed on schools by COVID. But we've ended up now where it has, what you vote locally, the rate of increase, for instance, you approve in your school budget, doesn't necessarily have a lot to do with the rate of increase you're actually going to see in your tax bills. And voters get confused about that. So let me back up for a second. One of the biggest challenges with Act 68 is that it is so Byzantine that nobody understands it. Voters go to the polls without really understanding, and how could they? What it actually means in many instances. So that system has now ended up, we're back to where we were in some levels pre-Act 60, where you have some of the districts in the state having the hardest time, the property poor districts, voting down their budgets, even though the budgets are very low, because they look at their tax bills, but if they voted their budgets, it wouldn't affect their tax bill anyway, because it's all part of this big cauldron. And the thing about this is, as I have said about this system, is that it's almost ingenious in that nobody is responsible, because you vote your budget, you vote your budget, you vote your budget, and it's kind of rational, hopefully what you're trying to do there. But then all this goes into one big pot in the end, and all the legislature has 2 rules. Really, the voters decide statewide, except they're imposing it on you're imposing it on me, and you're imposing it. It's in a way that's really not that democratic, actually. And so all the legislature does is set the multiplier. You've picked this. All the voters have done this big number, and the legislature basically just sets the multiplier for commercial property and primary residential property. And so that's the main job. The secondary job is that if we have money, we can put some more into the system to ameliorate what voters have voted across Vermont. So it's really a system that, in a way, like on many levels, nobody is really in control, because the legislature is statutorily required to set the multiplier to raise what we have to raise that voters voted. And yet voters aren't really voting on a statewide system, and a statewide, that's not what you're doing when you go to the polls. So the system is just not working. We have great disparities in the wrong way again in spending and ability to get budgets passed. And so what the legislature did was switch things to a foundation formula, which is actually what most states have. And what it, on its simplest level, of course there's a lot of detail in it, but at its simplest level, what it does is everybody across Vermont, there's a difference between residential and non-primary residential, but putting that aside, everybody across Vermont gets taxed the same per 100, and each district gets back the weighted amount per pupil. So per pupil, weighted per pupil amount back. And so it's on one level very simple, and so that's and then somebody is finally in control, because the legislature is in control because of setting the legislature will be the one setting the amount that gets raised by taxes, and therefore the amount that gets redistributed. So the way it's set up in the current legislation is it gets tied to in indices, it's not CPI, but effectively it's like CPI. And so there's a fixed number for the first year, and then it just goes up by the it's NEPA, but call it CPI. And so somebody is then at least in control. Somebody's actually responsible. And the irony, the legislature, of course, when the tax bills come out high, the legislature gets blamed for it, even though the legislature actually doesn't have, except that we need to fix the system. We fail to fix the system, we deserve it to get blamed for it. But so that's what's kind of going on between those two things, the old system and the new system. New system is easy to understand, and it actually is inherently sort of has all the feel of fairness. Everybody pays the same per 100. Every district gets back the same amount per weighted pupil.
And in terms of that weighting per pupil, what does that tend to look like, and how does that account for differences within districts? The most extreme examples, we could say Bennington versus Burlington, but Burlington or Bennington versus Northeast Kingdom districts. How does that weighting kind of function in that way?
So the good part about it is that some of the areas with less capacity will get more money, but some of them will also pay more. Depending on what the tax rate that people had been paying. Low spending districts might see their amount go up. But what we will end up with is a system, and by the way, it's phased in over the course of 5 years. What we will see rapidly is you won't have the distinction between rich districts and poor districts, because a weighted child is a weighted child, and everybody gets the same. So it has some compelling elements of just kind of obvious, intuitive fairness to it.
That's very interesting, and I think it gets to some of this question about where are the priorities for people, and what are their primary concerns. As you mentioned at the beginning, what drew you to education, separate from your various roles as a legislator, was caring about kids. That was one section of the task force report that I found very interesting, where they did list out amongst their sort of 6 priorities what was the public's ranking for them. And amongst those priorities, there's numbers associated with this in terms of how significant the differences are, but number 1 was to improve quality in education. Number 2 was equitable education opportunities. Number 3 was increased cost effectiveness, even though that seems to be the loudest voice that gets put out there very often. That was actually the 3rd for most people's actual concerns of where their policy priorities were. After that, economies of scale, then more coherent and consistent system, and then at the very bottom, more effective governance. And paired with that was this piece that I would be very interested to hear your perspective on as a policymaker about what could be differences in policymaker priorities and public priorities. They, in the report, what they put in, just because I think it'd be nice to hear you respond to it, they said policymakers often frame consolidation around systems level efficiency, while communities emphasize stability, identity, and student level impacts. Many experts prioritize statewide equity, while rural residents view school choice as essential access. Policymakers focus on long-term structural outcomes, while the public is concerned with near-term disruptions for students and families. And so just speaking to a little bit of how to balance those sometimes competing priorities or sometimes not so competing.
I mean, they are competing priorities, and this isn't a criticism of anybody, but, we all want it both ways, too. We want to maintain, small community schools, and I totally get it. And in fact, there's reasons to do that in a lot of businesses. But then we also want lower tax bills. I think in the end, when it comes right down to it, and you talk about the depth and breadth of Vermonters, if their tax bill goes up by 12%, that's what they're going to care about. And so we have to, to me, it's really two things. It's fixing the funding formula in a way that provides more, not less, educational opportunity for kids. And so, I think we have to, and I want to keep the discussion, equity in and of itself isn't that challenging, because equity can be a foot off the floor. You can, and I want to make sure that when we talk about equity, we're talking about this high off the floor. We're talking about excellent educational opportunity for every Vermont child. So the word equity alone doesn't do it. We got to talk about equity as this, and that's the goal, and that's what we're trying to achieve.
Absolutely, and sort of along those lines in terms of the cost savings, something else that the task force report, and again, they came out without recommending large districts, but part of the reason that they were less compelled by the need to do that was because they did not identify that as something that would be meaningfully cost saving at that level of consolidation.
I think, to be fair to the proponents of that system, it's about more than cost saving. It's about delivering better services for kids. And the ability to, with a larger district or construct, to be able to provide more specialized services. Some, the two districts are too small to hire. You still have kids in, the percentage of kids in real need of various services, and you're too small to hire the right person to do it. So if you do have a larger district, you can hire those specialized, the personnel to bring those specialized services, and they can go down to the different. So it's not just that argument is not, if Zoe Saunders were sitting here, she wouldn't be talking just about cost savings. She'd be talking about the fact that, at least in her mind, the larger districts provide better opportunities for kids.
And hence some of these shared service models, possibly in place of larger redistricting. From the task force perspective, they are coming to that as a middle ground, it seems, for them.
And that's not, that may be where we end up. I mean, I don't know. It's way too early to tell. It's going to be quite a session. We got a lot to figure out in a short amount of time.
Well, that's a perfect segue, because the session's coming right up, and we know how much this sort of loomed over everything else that was going on. There were so many different things that were happening simultaneously during the last session, but education was sort of the consistent piece. And it was something that, certainly from the governor's side, he was willing to push as hard as he possibly could, was happy to hold the state budget, keep the legislature in session until it was addressed, and just say, we have to do this. Whether it's exactly the way he wanted it or it had to be something slightly different, he was firm that it had to be done. What do you see as the dynamic going into this session around the sort of next phases of this work?
Well, the governor will be taking the same position this year, I have no doubt. And he's not wrong. It's not wrong that we have to deal with this. So I think, if you talk about the dynamic, that's the main dynamic. The governor is going to be just like last year, saying we've got to get this done. The legislature doesn't get to go home. And I think obviously there's a lot of room to figure out how to do it, and whether it's maps or some other mechanism for bringing up the level of it, while we at the same time we're controlling costs, at least be in control of costs. We're not going to be able to reduce costs immediately, but what we can do is control the rate of increase. And the rate of increase is that's the real issue right now, is the rate of increase. There's a lot of factors going into that. And let me just back up for a minute, or step aside for a second. I digress is the right word. Say that my committee has been holding hearings around the state. We only had time to do 5. There's 119 districts. We're visiting 5 of them. But partially because we tried getting out of the building last year and visiting some schools, and it's impossible. We're just an afternoon, in the Senate there's a morning committee and afternoon committee. We're just an afternoon committee. There's no time. And we can't miss our morning committee meetings. So I gave up last year and just realized that's not happening. So we're trying to get a few in before the session starts. And we're really trying to have the discussion. We set each day up with a tour of the school. They might as well see the school. We're there. And then we have, among other things, we always have a student panel. We have a teacher panel, because in the committees we tend to hear just from the superintendents and the like the NEA and the superintendents. And so we're trying to get down a little bit more granular and really get a feel for what's going on in these schools. And then, obviously the superintendents. And then we open it for a couple hours at the end for the public to come in and offer any comments. But we're trying to step back a little bit from the immediacy of this issue that we're discussing here today and just talk about that larger challenge of providing excellent educational opportunity. And one of the things, and I knew this going in, but it really has just been deeply reinforced. The work that teachers and staff, everybody in the school system, are doing for kids is heroic. The needs are huge, and the effort and the caring being given to kids in need is really, I have to say, even though, like I said, I guess I knew it intellectually, but seeing it firsthand was almost, it's almost like an emotional experience for the whole committee. It's really quite remarkable. We visited, we started, the first school we went to was in Canaan, in the northeast corner of the state. You can stand in one place and hit Canada with a rock and New Hampshire with a rock. So it's up there. And it's a tiny little school. And it's small by necessity because there's nobody else around. They're going to be there no matter what because they're truly small by necessity. But the effort, the teachers, when we did the teachers panel and they were talking about the things that they all do to provide opportunity for those kids, with their after-school programs, they're all doing all the teachers are doing a couple of after-school programs, so it's kind of amazing. But that's repeated throughout the state. So I don't know. I just want to step back and say that no matter what we're doing, nobody, at least in my mind, is it's not criticizing anybody in the system because they're doing work that is exhausting. And I'm in awe.
Absolutely. And can you talk a little bit about the work of your committee and what you think those visits will sort of do to inform it in terms of how you're approaching the upcoming session?
Well, I think, number one, we've seen some really good schools. And one of them, kind of mid-sized, and, doing really good work within a smaller district, smallish district, producing great results. And all the kids, by the way, just speak glowingly of their. And I realize, of course, they're giving us, we see one, we know that, yeah. But you can tell. So there's, so we have to, the do no damage part is, I think, really instructive for the committee, because, and also the deep connection to community of these schools and vice versa is just so I think having the committee go into the session really recognizing the level of services that kids actually need these days, the mental health, poverty, and the things that these schools are doing to deal with that. I think for us to really understand that, to internalize that is really important as we're thinking about the work going forward. I think to really internalize the determination and the commitment that these schools have for kids is really something we need to go into the session with internalized. So I think that's what's happening. We weren't trying to change the world with these visits. It really was just getting as good a feel as we possibly could in some different settings. I made sure they were all different for what's actually going on within the schools and the kids and their needs. And I don't want to go on about this. In fact, we got to be careful about time. But in Canaan, it really had. I really realized, and I think we all did, that outside of that school, in that community, in that area, there is absolutely nothing for kids. And that, but the school is filling that entire social need, interaction need, and and the clubs that they're doing and the competitions they go in. But if that wasn't there doing that, there's no ice rink, there's no, it's just the way it is. So do no harm.
Absolutely. And quickly before we wrap up, what would some of these changes mean for Bennington? Since we are here, obviously, taken very seriously, this is a statewide concern.
Yeah.
It needs to be sort of on a statewide level, but knowing that each school, each community has its own dynamics, has its own needs that need to be fulfilled, what does this look like locally?
I think the first, before I get to that, the thing you said that's really important is each community needs district. They are all different. And so we have to be really careful and really acknowledge that Bennington is very different than Burlington, or very different than wherever. I spend a lot of time with both superintendents and with the boards on each end of the county to really it's very different. But to really make sure that I'm deeply in tune with the needs of my district. After all, I represent this district. So Bennington, relatively speaking, if you look at size and needs, Bennington is, you've got the scale. Bennington's running efficiently in the grand scheme. You've got a, kind of a semi-regional a middle school, regional high school, and a few smaller elementary schools. But one of the things that I tried to do last year, because what will happen out of the bill if it was just passed the way it's passed, is that there would be more money for Bennington, but taxes would go up. So number one, it's phased in over 5 years. But number two, what we had in my committee's bill was the ability for a community like Bennington to vote to spend and pay as only 90%, if that's what they wanted to do. And you could vote anywhere between 90% and 110% of what the amount would have been that you would be given. And I thought that was important for a town like Bennington. It's actually running an efficient system. And if you're already at efficiency and you can run it well, for 90%, I was in favor of that, but that fell through. I got it out of the committee that way, but it didn't survive the rest of the process because everybody was just saying, well, it has to be exactly the same. Exactly the same always makes me nervous. So, but, I think in the grand scheme of things, Bennington is likely to be impacted less than other places in the state might be, because you have that scale and efficiency on this end, on the southern end of the county.
That's very good to know, and something to certainly keep an eye on as we head into the session. There'll be much more to talk about, and I'm sure that we will return to many of these themes within education and many topics beyond education itself. But I'm really looking forward to those conversations, and I appreciate the one that we got to have today.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I really appreciate having the opportunity to speak to people on this end of the county about the potential impact on them.
Absolutely. I appreciate having you here today, and for everyone out there, tune into CAD TV starting at the end of January for weekly legislative updates with a rotating cast of legislators, which will include Senator Bongartz and all the other folks who represent us here in Bennington County. So that's it for this pre-session episode of In Session, and we look forward to you joining us for Season 2.